Snow fell in soft, unbroken sheets over the plains, turning the Boone Ranch into a pale dream of silence. The moon hung low, a dull coin in the winter sky, casting faint light over the warped fence posts and the single trail of footprints leading to the porch. Inside, the wind moaned against the shutters, and Calder Boone stood by the hearth, his baby pressed against his chest. The child's cries had long passed the hour of comfort and now filled the house with something raw, an echo of grief and life all at once. Calder's eyes were hollow with sleepless nights, his broad shoulders bent like an old oak in winter. He had known silence since the day his wife was buried beneath the hill behind the barn, where the snow never seemed to melt. When the knock came, it was almost part of the wind. 3 faint taps, hesitant, followed by a pause. Calder's head turned sharply. Few souls dared the plains after dark, fewer still in a storm like this. He set the child into the cradle and reached for the lantern. The wick flared weakly, its glow trembling against the frost on the window pane. Through the fog of his breath, he saw her, thin as a shadow, clutching a bundle to her chest. Snow clung to her lashes, her hair wild with wind, her shawl more holes than fabric. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. The door stood between 2 kinds of cold. When Calder opened it, the wind rushed in, scattering ash from the hearth across the floorboards. The woman's lips were blue, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I'm looking for work, sir. I can sew, clean, care for a child, if you'll allow me to stay the night." Her eyes darted toward the cradle, then back to his face. Her name, she said, was Eveline Hart. Once a seamstress, now with nowhere left to stitch herself to the world. Calder studied her, the lines of suspicion drawn deep across his brow. The townsfolk's voices echoed in his mind, warning him about strangers, about thieves, about what grief can make a man invite into his home. He should have turned her away. The baby cried again, sharp and piercing, the sound that had filled every hour since his wife's death. Calder exhaled, long and heavy, and stepped aside. "Come in," he said. Eveline crossed the threshold like someone stepping into a memory. The heat of the fire met her face, bringing tears she tried to hide. The room smelled of milk, pine smoke, and loneliness. She stood near the wall, unsure if she was welcome to move further. Calder handed her a chair but said nothing. Only the baby's soft cries filled the space between them. She warmed her hands by the hearth, her fingers trembling as she reached for the kettle on the hook. "He's hungry," she said quietly, glancing toward the child. Calder hesitated but nodded. Eveline moved with gentle confidence, wrapping the baby in her shawl, whispering words too soft for him to catch. She hummed, and the room seemed to breathe again. The child quieted, drifting toward sleep. Calder found himself watching her, not with desire, but with the startled relief of someone remembering what peace looks like. Later, as she stitched a torn blanket, he saw the way the needle moved, steady, precise, almost reverent. The sound of it slipping through fabric was the only rhythm the house had known for months. Calder leaned back, eyes half closed, listening. The storm outside beat against the window, but the fire glowed stronger. Somewhere between the whistle of the wind and the baby's soft sigh, the night began to lose its cruelty. By dawn, the snow had piled knee-deep around the house. Eveline had fallen asleep by the hearth, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her hair damp with melted frost. Calder lifted the baby from her arms, careful not to wake her. He had not realized how long it had been since another soul had shared his silence. As the first light broke over the ridge, the plains shimmered silver, untouched. Calder thought of his wife's grave beneath that same snow, and wondered if grace, in some strange form, had found its way back to him. When Eveline woke, the room was golden with firelight and the smell of coffee. Calder stood by the stove, his back to her, pouring a cup. She sat up quickly, apologizing for dozing off, but he only handed her the cup without a word. She thanked him, her voice fragile but sincere. The warmth of it seeped into her hands, and for a fleeting second, she felt like she belonged somewhere again. Word travels fast in small towns, even when the roads are buried under snow. By afternoon, Martha Keller had seen smoke from the Boone chimney, and a figure moving inside that was not Calder. By evening, the gossip had already spread. "He's taken in a woman," they whispered. "A widow, maybe worse." Eveline felt their eyes when she went to fetch water from the well. The whispers pressed against her back like the wind itself. She said nothing, her chin lifted, though her eyes stayed fixed on the ground. Calder noticed. He saw how she began to work longer hours, sewing by candlelight, mending clothes that no one had asked her to mend. He saw how she smiled at Finn but never quite at herself. There was a strength in her silence that unsettled him, a mirror to his own. One night, he placed a small cup of coffee on her sewing table before dawn. When she found it, still warm, she touched the rim with her fingers and smiled faintly. No words were exchanged, but something had changed. As days passed, the ranch took on a fragile rhythm. The wind howled, the snow fell, and yet inside, the rooms grew softer. Eveline hummed while she worked, her voice low and warm. Calder, once haunted by the echoes of loss, began to listen for that sound in the evenings. Sometimes, he would catch her gazing out the window toward the distant hills. "Your family back that way?" he asked once. She shook her head. "No one left," she said simply. The air between them was thick with the unspoken. How survival often feels like punishment. One night, the wind carried a different sound. The crying of a coyote, long and lonely. Calder sat by the fire, oiling his rifle, while Eveline sewed a patch on the baby's blanket. Her hands paused mid-stitch. "I lost my husband to the mines," she said quietly. "He went in one morning and didn't come back. They told me it was quick, but it never is." Calder's hands froze on the barrel of his rifle. The fire popped, throwing sparks across the floor. "I buried mine by the barn," he said, voice rough. "She caught fever last spring." The words came out like stones, heavy and final. For a long time they sat in silence, two widowed hearts stitched by loss. Outside, the snow began to fall again, but softer now, gentler, as if the sky itself was tired of being cruel. Eveline finished her stitching and laid the blanket over the cradle. Finn stirred but did not wake. She watched the baby breathe, his tiny chest rising and falling like a promise. Calder looked at her and saw something he hadn't felt since before death had claimed his home. A flicker of life that refused to be extinguished. The following morning, Calder chopped wood behind the house. His breath rose in pale clouds, the axe striking in steady rhythm. Eveline stood at the window, holding the baby, watching him work. The sun had returned, faint but honest, casting gold across the snow. The narrator's voice, quiet and aged, might have said then, "In the hush of winter, some hearts thaw slow, one breath at a time." Eveline smiled without knowing why, her hand brushing the baby's hair as if to thank the world for letting them see another morning. Inside, the fire burned bright, the kettle hissed softly. For the first time in months, Calder Boone's house did not feel like a tomb, but a beginning he did not yet understand. And though the snow outside promised many more cold nights ahead, something within that small, fragile home had begun to stir. Something warm and living, waiting to be named. By late January, the world beyond the Boone Ranch had turned to glass. Frozen rivers, silvered fields, the sound of hooves muffled by snow. Inside, life had begun to breathe again, though no one dared to name it. Eveline moved through the house with quiet grace, her hands mending, tending, steadying. Calder watched her from the edges of his grief, uncertain whether to thank her or fear what she stirred within him. She had been there a month, yet every morning felt as fragile as the first. The unspoken question of how long such kindness could last lingering between them like frost on a window. The gossip had not thawed. When Eveline went to town for thread, the women at the general store turned their backs, their voices low but sharp. "Living under his roof, no ring between them," one said, shameful. The words clung to her coat all the way home. She said nothing to Calder, but he saw the tightness in her jaw, the way she set her sewing basket down with more force than needed. That evening, as she folded the baby's blanket, her hands trembled. Calder placed a rough palm over hers, not as comfort, but as quiet recognition. "They talk because they've nothing worth keeping quiet about," he said. The moment passed like smoke, yet something unseen bound them closer. Winter deepened. The storms came harder, snow piling against the windows until the world outside disappeared entirely. Calder worked longer hours, chopping wood, repairing fences buried under drifts. Eveline stayed near the fire with little Finn, humming to keep him calm. At night, when the wind screamed and the house shook, she would wake to find Calder standing by the cradle, his hand on the child's chest, making sure he still breathed. Sometimes their eyes would meet in the half-dark, and neither would speak. It was enough to know they were not alone. One night, while Eveline mended a tear in Calder's coat, she asked softly, "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" The question startled him. He looked at her, snowmelt glinting on his eyelashes. "Every time the wind howls," he said, "but the land doesn't let go easy." Eveline nodded, biting the thread to tie the stitch. "I understand that," she murmured. "Some things hold you even when they're empty." The silence that followed felt heavier than words could carry. The next day, Sheriff Hollis arrived, his horse snorting clouds of breath in the cold. He came with the town's unspoken worries tucked behind his polite tone. People are talking, Calder, he said, glancing toward the house. They say it ain't right, her livin' here. Calder's jaw tightened. You come to throw her out, Sheriff? Hollis sighed, eyes softening. No, but folks can be cruel when winter keeps 'em bored. Calder said nothing, only turned back to his work. When the sheriff rode off, the snow swallowed his tracks in minutes, leaving the ranch alone again under a wide white sky. That night, Eveline packed her things. Her hands shook as she folded the shawl she'd arrived in, threadbare and still smelling faintly of pine smoke. She stood over the cradle, looking down at the sleeping child, and whispered, "You deserve peace, little one." When she opened the door, the wind struck her full in the face, stinging her eyes with snow. Calder was standing there, as if the night itself had brought him to stop her. "You leaving before he wakes?" he asked, voice low, unreadable. Eveline couldn't meet his gaze. "It's time," she said. "The town's right. I shouldn't be here." The silence between them seemed to stretch into the cold. Calder's voice broke it softly. "Then stay for me to say goodbye in daylight." She hesitated, snowflakes catching in her hair, and nodded. Sleep did not come. Sometime near dawn, lightning cracked across the horizon. The storm that followed carried no mercy. Calder woke to the smell of smoke, thick and bitter. The barn was burning, flames clawing through the wind like living beasts. "The horses!" he shouted, pulling on his coat. Eveline grabbed the baby and followed him out into the blizzard. The fire turned the snow orange, the heat pushing against the cold in a violent war of elements. Calder shouted over the roar, "Stay inside!" But she was already running toward the barn, her skirt whipping like a flag. He cursed under his breath and went after her. Inside, the air was thick with ash. Eveline coughed, pulling open the stall doors, the terrified horses thrashing. Calder grabbed her arm, yanking her back as a beam cracked overhead. "You'll die in here!" he shouted. She pulled free, her eyes fierce. "So will they." Another crash, a rush of flame, and Calder threw his coat around her, dragging her toward the door. The world blurred into heat and smoke. When they stumbled out, Eveline fell to her knees, gasping. Calder wrapped his arms around her, pressing her face against his chest as the barn collapsed behind them. The sound like thunder breaking. For a moment it felt like the fire was trying to take everything the snow hadn't. When the storm cleared, nothing remained of the barn but blackened wood and the faint smell of sorrow. Calder carried Eveline inside. Her skin was cold despite the burns, her breath shallow. He laid her by the hearth, his hands shaking as he covered her with blankets. The baby cried from the cradle, a desperate human sound that filled the silence. Calder turned to her, his voice rough as gravel. "You should have stayed inside." She opened her eyes weakly. "I couldn't watch something else burn." Then her lashes fluttered closed. Hours passed before she stirred again. When she woke, the fire had burned low. Calder sat beside her, his hands wrapped in rags from where the flames had bitten him. Neither spoke. The air smelled of smoke and pine resin. Finally, Eveline whispered, "You saved me." He shook his head. "No. You saved what's left of me." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "Maybe we saved each other then." The fire popped, and in that fragile sound was something like forgiveness. Days later, the townspeople came to help rebuild what they could. Martha Keller stood at the edge of the yard, her mouth thin with judgment. But when she saw Eveline standing beside Calder, her arm wrapped in bandages, her expression softened. "Reckon she's tougher than we thought," someone muttered. By dusk, even the whispers quieted. The sheriff tipped his hat to Eveline before leaving. "You've earned your place here," he said. She nodded, tears bright in her eyes. For the first time, the town's silence felt like respect, not condemnation. Spring crept in slowly. The snow melted into streams that trickled through the pastures. Eveline planted a small garden beside the porch, her hands still marked by fire, but steady. Calder rebuilt the barn with fewer boards, but stronger ones. They spoke little, yet their silences carried warmth. Sometimes in the evenings, Calder would play a weathered harmonica, the tune low and wistful. Eveline would sit nearby, rocking Finn, humming under her breath. The house, once so empty, now breathed like something alive. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Eveline stood at the doorway, the same one she had once knocked upon in desperation. The air was soft, the smell of earth replacing winter's chill. Calder came to stand beside her, his hands scarred but sure. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The light between them said enough, that some bonds don't need names to be real. Eveline looked out over the land, now green at last, and whispered, "I'm home." Calder glanced at her, a slow, almost shy smile ghosting across his face. "You always were," he said. Inside, the baby stirred, letting out a soft cry. Eveline went to him, lifting him gently, her voice tender as she soothed him. Calder watched from the doorway, his heart swelling with a peace he hadn't thought possible. The harmonica rested on the table beside the fire, waiting. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain, renewal after ruin. If you had stood there that evening, you might have thought the story ended there, with the woman who came for work and found belonging, with the man who lost everything and learned to keep something sacred again. But life in the West never ends in neat lines. It continues, slow and wide as the plains, carrying memory like dust. Years later, folks would still talk about that night the barn burned, how love sometimes enters through fire and stays through silence. And if an old voice were telling you this tale, it might pause before the last words and say, sometimes grace doesn't ride in on a horse. It walks barefoot through the snow, asking only for work and leaving warmth in its wake. The wind would hush, the fire would crackle, and you'd feel it too. That quiet knowing that the hardest winters often bring the gentlest springs. If this story warmed your heart, subscribe for more Wild West tales, where hearts heal slower than the setting sun.